Hello. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to lovely Porto. And I'm glad so many are here. I understand that there is some queuing at the registration, so maybe we will have some additional people dropping in during the next half hour. But I think we have to start now to stick to the schedule. My name is Magnus Domlof, and I'm from Sweden, Umeå, a neonatologist, and I'm really happy to have invited such excellent teachers here to this course. And the first lecture we will hear is by Richard Ehrenkranz, who is here from Yale at the US. And then we have Nick Embleton from Newcastle, who will talk about assessment of nutritional status. And then it will be Hans van Godever from Amsterdam talking about parenteral nutrition. He will be a little late, so we'll probably switch the last two speaks. Then I will talk about enteral nutrition. And then in the afternoon, we will have some hands-on group sessions where we will actually be doing some real-life cases and discussing how to prescribe nutrition and what are the important things to consider with regard to nutrition. And can I just ask you, because I'm not really familiar with your background, could you raise your hands, everybody who has actually been in a situation where you have been prescribing nutrition to preterm infants, because that's the focus of this class? Okay, that's the vast majority. That's great, because that's really will be the focus of the afternoon, the hands-on, what we do in the clinic. And then, and I think it's really nice to have so many people attending this course, because we have felt this last decade that has been an increasing interest for neonatal and preterm nutrition. Alexander Lapillon from Paris, he has this slide, which I don't have now, but it shows the number of published papers in respiratory distress syndrome, which is like the classic research field in neonatology, and the number of papers in preterm nutrition. And actually, the number of papers in preterm nutrition has now exceeded the number of papers on respiratory distress syndrome. So that's interesting. It's a new trend that we are focusing on now, trying to optimize, because that's one of the areas where we still have plenty of room to optimize nutrition to improve the future health of our babies. And actually, exactly that connection is the topic of Richard's first talk. So please welcome Richard.
Good morning. And Magnus, thank you for a lovely invitation to come to Porto and to speak to this group. There's a lot one can say about this area, so we'll begin and hopefully have some time for questions. First of all, in the spirit of the meeting, I have no disclosures, only that I wish I did. The objectives for today's talk are going to be to review the goals of nutritional management of extremely preterm infants, to review the data that improving nutritional support during the NICU stay is associated with improved outcomes, improved growth, and neurodevelopmental outcomes, and to discuss feeding guidelines that minimize the interruption of nutritional support following birth and that improve outcomes. First of all, everybody in this room is probably familiar with the recommendation, the goal of neonatal nutrition that I've listed on the slide. This dates back to the late 70s, when it was first published by the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Nutrition. It's been in the pediatric handbook. It's been updated several times. Versions of it have been in the Canadian Pediatric Society and in the SPGAM guidelines. And this recommendation is basically to provide nutrients to approximate the rate of growth and composition of weight gain for a normal fetus of the same postmenstrual age, to maintain normal concentrations of nutrients in blood and tissue, and to achieve a satisfactory functional development. I view that as just a great goal, but I think we're all conscious of the fact that it takes a number of things to try to achieve it. First, we have to try to understand what is appropriate intrauterine growth? What's that rate that we're targeting? If we're going to target it, probably it's going to be that 50th percentile. And we need to understand the nutrient needs that are going to be necessary to achieve that. Unfortunately, the optimal diet is unknown, and we're going to hear more about that today. How we assess growth in babies is not standard. We'll hear more about that. And there's a lot of controversy over the feasibility and appropriateness of actually achieving these goals. This is a in utero growth curve based on estimated fetal weight gains based upon ultrasound that's used by our MFM group to monitor growth of babies that they're following. So the lowest line here is the 3rd percentile, 50th, and the 97th percentile. So these are, if we think about growth, this is the full population. These are babies that are growing in utero, and this would be, if we knew and could track growth, this would be that target line. There's not a lot of data on this. And so what most of us actually wind up using are things like that actually date to the Lutsenko curves from 1966, which were based upon 4,700 babies born a mile high in Denver. And it comes with all the caveats of altitude on growth. Nonetheless, it looked at weight, length, head circumference, provided a ponderal index, led to the description of small for gestational age, large for gestational age, and appropriate for gestational age. There have been a number of versions of this, local and regional, countrywide, that have been used in the United States, in Europe, and around the world. The one that's been more recently used in the U.S. is this one by Tanis Fenton. Was published in BMC Pediatrics in 2003. But it's not it's not one population. It's a number of curves. If you've used this, you're aware of that. The weight curves here are from Montreal, about 700,000 children. This is then merged with the CDC 2000 curves, which are cross-sectional. The length and head circumference data up here are Australian and Scandinavian data, and again, the CDC 2000. So it's not one population of babies. Nonetheless, because it was on a nice curve, or nice x-axis going out to about 52 weeks, it allowed us to track babies in the nursery and through the first several months post-term equivalent. More recently, this has been, Tanis and Jay Kim have come out with this curve. This is again in BMC Pediatrics. Came out in this May. And this is, again, not one population. This is based upon 6 populations, or 6 papers, rather. Set up the same way, although now we have a boys curve and a girls curve, and there's a link to actually do standard deviations and z-scores that allows one to actually follow growth. A nice set of data. Irene Olson, using a pediatrics data set, published this paper in 2010. This is one set of babies and all of these curves. There's the A and B, girls, boys down here, weight, length, and head circumference on the right side. And again, this is one set of infants, U.S. national, about 40 states, 250,000 roughly infants, but they contribute to all of the curves. In some sense, this is a better set because it's not taking data and putting it together. The 2013 curves from Fenton, because it's more of a meta-analysis, the way they put it together, has a lot of benefits to those curves. This has had some licensing or copyright issues with the Academy of Pediatrics in terms of being widely available, whereas the open publication on BMC Pediatrics has made those curves more widely available. It's likely that the Intergrowth 21st study that's being done, Intergrowth 21 project that's being done currently that will have data on intrauterine growth based upon prospectively following a large population of women around the world with ultrasound and serial ultrasound measures may provide us that more population set of growth curves of things to target. That data will be not available until the earliest of probably fall 2014, early winter 2015. These are data that I had the opportunity of putting together with the Neonatal Research Network, the NICHD Neonatal Research Network, and which we published in 1999. These are infants that are a birth weight group, 501 to 1,500 grams. When we set up this curve, we only use babies less than 30 weeks because, of course, as you go beyond 30 weeks, on birth weight curve, set of data, you begin to really enrich that data for gestational age infants. We then plotted it on some intrauterine growth curves. These are the Alexander growth curves, which were based upon 3 million plus U.S. singleton births and from 1991. And what we saw, and we were not the only people who've described this, but that as infants grow, they're growing less than the 10th percentile as they get close to discharge. There's some recent UK population data that many of you may have seen that basically shows the same type of thing going on, that these are infants that are just growing below the 10th percentile, which when we think about pediatric growth below the 10th percentile is growth failure or failure to thrive. And this is what we're doing. And we think when these kids are growing, they're growing steadily. Most of us think, hey, they're growing well, until you take a look at this kind of data. Now, we understand why some of this may be happening, and this is some data that Nick Embleton and Richard Cook published a number of years ago, showing that it's very easy for infants in our nurseries to develop energy protein deficits over the first several weeks of life. The smallest babies, those babies in the open circles, less than 30 weeks of gestation, develop a greater energy and protein deficit, and we believe that that contributes to weight below the weight z-scores that are much below zero, and again, greater in the smallest gestational age infants. On top of that, we also know, and this is again the NICHD data, that infants who have major morbidities tend to grow slower. Now, generally you collect this data from looking backwards. So you have a population, they have morbidities. You say, how do babies with bronchopulmonary dysplasia, with late onset infection, with NEC, how do they grow? So you have a population, NEC, BPD, versus non-NEC, versus non-BPD. And you plot these, and you come up with curves like this. So morbidities, slow growth, energy, protein deficits, slower growth. And we can very easily come up to these type of questions when you look at this, because this is observational data. Did slower growth result from suboptimal nutritional support provided during the management of these neonatal illnesses, or due to the existence of the morbidities? Were morbidities, NEC, BPD, late onset infection, more likely to occur in infants who are receiving suboptimal nutritional support? And to what degree does practice variation influence nutritional support and growth rate? Now, if we knew the way we think we know with RDS, that we can give surfactant replacement, we have certain ventilation strategies, it would be easy. But probably in every one of your nurseries that you work in, there are several approaches to nutritional support of these infants, and that leads to practice variation within your own center and between centers. This is data from the NICHD Nutritional Network. Again, this is a secondary analysis of data from our glutamine supplementation trial, in which we provided 20% of the parental nutrition as glutamine to see if we could reduce the incidence of late onset infection. We didn't accomplish that, but it gave us a very rich data set to look at a number of things. And this analysis just separated the babies, and this is just AGA babies, by severity of illness. This is not with a crib score or a SNAP score or anything other than were they ventilated for the first 7 days of life or not, because that's the best we had. And so we come up with, again, these are AGA infants. These are our less critically ill infants, more critically ill infants. And this looks at energy intake and total fluid intake over the first week of life. And what you can see is that the less critically ill infants were receiving more energy, and more of that as non-protein energy, because by the end of the week, we were given pretty equal amounts of protein energy. The minimal enteral intake provided during the first week was also greater in our less critically ill. Total energy was greater, and these kids also received less fluid than our more critically ill infants. There's a little bit of a disconnect here. Why? Well, you could say, well, these kids are less ill. Of course they're going to be getting a little bit more enteral nutrition, okay? But why are these kids getting less fluid than our more critically ill infants when we also know that more fluid goes on to facilitate the development of bronchopulmonary dysplasia? So we're left with our practice, and when we looked at that for the second and third week of life, because you're probably familiar, if you look back from that developing bronchopulmonary dysplasia and you look backwards and you separate those kids, you can actually see that those infants who are develop bronchopulmonary dysplasia grow slower over the first few weeks of life. And so if we look at these data and we see the same type of pattern continue for the first several weeks, our practice is leading to that. Again, this is observational data. It's got a lot of problems with it, and I'm the first to admit it. Okay, I want to sort of switch. There are a couple of, you saw my objectives, so I want to move this to the next phase here, and I'm going to present just some points from several papers that are in the literature. And what I'm going to try to separate and lead you through is the concept that better nutritional support is associated with improved growth and less extrauterine growth restriction, that improved growth correlates with improved neurodevelopmental outcomes, and that better nutritional support is associated with improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. So there's sort of three concepts. But if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, maybe. That's what I'm going to try to get you to think about. And this is how this sets up, and these are some of the papers we're going to talk about. So better nutritional support leads to improved growth and less extrauterine growth restriction. Improved growth leads to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. Better nutritional support leads to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. And we're going to deal with the first group of papers and just touch on a couple of them, that better nutritional support leads to improved growth and less extrauterine growth restriction. The majority of these papers, in fact, only 2 of them are based on described data from randomized controlled trials. All the rest of them are observational data. But the first one, the one that introduced the expression early aggressive nutritional support in the neonatal period, was this one by Wilson and colleagues. And this was published in 1997. This study was done in the mid-90s. And this was not too different than the way many of us were nourishing infants in the mid-90s. And their intervention doesn't seem that great 18 years later. But in the mid-90s, this was a big intervention to actually be more aggressive in providing early parenteral protein, earlier parenteral lipid, and early enteral feeding to everybody. And this is what they provided, and this is their control group. You're probably familiar with this data or this study. And what did they achieve? Well, this is their control curve in terms of growth as they got towards term equivalence, and they shifted this curve up. So by providing better early enteral nutrition, they were able to move that curve up. So they achieved better growth. They did not see worse or more frequent NEC. They didn't see major changes in morbidities. There was a suggestion that there was less late onset infection, but they demonstrated better growth. Dinerstein and colleagues, in a historical control, basically demonstrated this with a larger data set. And what you can see, this is their conventional. And this is not too different than Wilson's group, starting at day 3 with half a gram of protein per kilogram per day, half a gram of lipid on the third to fourth day of life, beginning enteral feeds when the infants were stable. We sort of know what that means. Who knows? To their more aggressive. And we know from data from Scott Denny and others that infants need about 1.5 grams per kilogram per day of protein from within the first day of life. Otherwise, they're going to start to develop that protein deficit that Nick described, because they're losing protein in the urine, and they lose that if we just give them glucose, and they lose that if they are getting a protein parental solution. And we need to give them this at least to try to achieve zero balance. When we give them above that, we start to put them into positive protein and nitrogen balance. They began lipids within the first 24 hours and enteral feeds. And this is the regimen. And they achieved less protein and energy deficit, as shown here, in their more aggressive group compared to their conventional group in both protein and energy. I'm not sure. It's interesting. It shows up on my slide, but the aggressive group is up here on both of these. It's not showing up very well on this slide. I apologize. And this is their anthropometrics and their outcomes, and they achieved regained birth weight sooner, full enteral feeding sooner, better anthropometrics as they get towards discharge. So I said I'm only going to touch on a couple of these because a lot of time doesn't give us a chance to really go into each one of these studies, but the concept is the same, that better nutritional support in the first group of papers improves growth and provided less extrauterine growth restriction. The next group are improved growth leads to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. So the issue here is that these papers don't give us a lot of nutritional data, but they show us better outcomes. This is data from our growth study. These are data collected in the mid-90s, observational data. Developmental follow-up was done on only those babies less than 1,000 grams, from 501 to 1,000 grams. And what you can see, and we then broke the infants who came back into follow-up. It was about 500 infants. We broke those down for each 100-gram birth weight interval. We separated the growth rate velocity. So this lowest growth weight velocities, this quartile, included babies 501 to 600 grams, 601 to 700 grams, and so forth, so that each one of these growth rate velocities represented or had infants from those birth weight intervals. And what we see is that the Bailey MDI, Bailey PDI, neurodevelopmental impairment, more of a composite score, as our growth velocity increased, there were decreases in each one of those parameters, suggesting that with better growth, there is improved outcomes based upon the Bailey. There was less cerebral palsy in those growth weight groups. Again, this was a range of 12 to 21 grams per kilogram per day in terms of growth velocity. And this is as we looked at weight. Weight less than the 10th percentile or weight, length, and head circumference less than 10th percentile as the babies came into follow-up at 18 months. And you can see that this parameters less than 10th percentile are still common as we get these babies out to 18 months corrected age, but less common in those infants who are growing better. Brenda Poindexter looked at a more recent group from the Neonatal Network, reported this data last May at the USPAS meeting. This is a group of kids that were actually based upon gestational age, and they were born from 2008 to 2010. These are basically what the NIH network calls generic database and generic follow-up. not very much nutritional information provided or collected. The infants range from 23 to 26 weeks of gestation, survived to discharge. Almost 1,400 infants were seen at 18 to 22 months corrected age. And the growth velocity ranged from 12 to 18 grams per kilogram per day in quartiles, and these quartiles were now set up by gestational age week as opposed to 100-gram birth weight interval. And you can see again that as weight velocity, growth velocity increased from quartile 1 to quartile 4, now we're using the Bailey 3, so this was the cognitive less than 70, cognitive less than 85. You can see that as weight growth velocity increases, there's less moderate to severe CP, less, and neurodevelopmental impairment. This is severe and profound. Also decreases as growth velocity increases. And you can see the adjusted odds ratios for those below. Belford provided some data, again, observational data taken from the Dino trial. That's the DHA for improvement in neurodevelopmental outcome. She looked at infants who received the supplement, who they had anthropometrics at 4, 12, and 18 months corrected age, looked at Bailey 2 scores at 18 months corrected age, and found that if you looked at weight gain between 1 week and term, greater weight gain was associated with higher Bailey scores. And that was even better if you looked at babies just less than 1,250 grams birth weight. Their greater weight gain for them led to stronger associations with the MDI and the PDI between term and four months. So term equivalents to 4 months, greater weight gain and linear growth, higher PDI scores. Between 4 months and 12 months, so this is post-term, no growth associations with the Bailey scores. So again, sort of looking at improved growth, improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. The next are 3 studies that look at nutritional support and actually show better growth, but also that better growth and better nutritional support was associated with better neurodevelopmental outcomes. And I put the plus minus in these 2 of these boxes because it's not as strong. The numbers are low, but they're a suggestion that this is that these associations are there. This is from the glutamine trial from Brenda Poindexter was a PI on that, and we separated this into those infants who received an earlier or larger amount of parenteral protein within the first 5 days of age. They needed to receive 3 grams of protein per kilogram per day. That was our early group. The majority of the babies did not. And we looked at anthropometrics at 36 weeks postmenstrual age. And you can see that the early group had better weight at 36 weeks. There were fewer that were less than the 10th percentile, fewer that were less than the 5th percentile, and they had better length and head circumference measurements. One would have hoped that that might have been associated with some things as we got out to developmental follow-up. And we saw something. We saw that the infants who that made a difference for were the males, not the females. So this is head circumference less than the 10th percentile, and you can see at 18 to 22 months corrected age. Fewer of the males who received the higher amount of protein had head circumference less than the 10th percentile and less than the 5th percentile, but not the females. This type of gender difference has been reported in other studies. Unfortunately, we did not see any difference in developmental follow-up, either in just males versus females or in the total group. That's why I had that plus minus in there, because there was a suggestion, but it never reached statistical significance. You know, Bonnie Stevens at Brown reported data as a single center study. Brown was a member of the NICHD network during this period of time, but this is a single center study reporting the same type of data, first week protein intake and the relationship of protein and energy intake on developmental outcome. And this was their step-up daily. They had 124 infants, and their mean protein intake over the first week of life was at 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. Their regression analysis, controlling for the appropriate type of things, showed that for each gram of protein per kilogram per day increase in protein led to an 8.2-point increase in the MDI. Now, you should know that the MDI, one standard deviation, is 15 points. So an 8.2-point increase is greater than a 50% increase. This is a huge effect. Unfortunately, the protein increase only accounted for 17% of the variance in the MDI, so it didn't explain everything. If you looked at it from an energy point of view, each 10 kcal increase in energy increase led to a 4.6-point increase in the MDI. Again, a large increase. It's over 1/3 of a standard deviation, or about 1/3 of a standard deviation, and again, accounted for about 18% of the variance. So they sort of conclude and show also that higher protein intake during the first week of life was also associated with greater length growth, fewer infants less than the 10th percentile. They don't give a lot of numbers, but there's some suggestions in that paper. And a more recent paper looking at lipid emulsion by DiTrolli showed, this is again a retrospective analysis, and this is not a trial, of prospectively collected data on a cohort of 48 infants less than 28 weeks of gestation. The univariate statistics showed significant correlation between developmental quotient at a year-corrected age and the cumulative intake of energy and lipid at 14 days of age. Developmental quotient at a year-corrected age and weight gain from birth to day 28 of life. However, they didn't show any correlations between 1 year corrected age and between outcomes at 1 year and early protein and carbohydrate. They make a statement in the paper that this was probably because their protein was already optimized in terms of what they're providing for the babies. So there wasn't a big increase or big difference between the groups, and the issue is really how they provided the lipid emulsions and moved on to enteral feeds. When they did their multivariate analysis, and you can see what they controlled for, the only association between developmental outcome at a year-corrected age only the relationship between developmental outcome at a year-corrected age and lipid intake at 14 days remained significant. So now the last two papers, and these had data or present data with each one of these points, that better nutritional support leads to improved growth and less extrauterine growth restriction, that improved growth leads to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes, and that better nutritional support leads to improved neurodevelopmental outcomes. The TAN paper is actually two papers, or the TAN study is actually two papers, and is a randomized trial, and Franz's is an observational study. The TAN paper, they describe a more hyperalimented parental nutrition that was provided to the infants, and this is the difference between their control and their hyperalimented. But if you look at the other things that they provided to everybody, all of the infants had parental nutrition started within the first 24 hours of age. There were stepwise increases from 1 gram per kilogram per day of protein and fat to 4 in the hyperalimented, but to only 3 in the control. And expressed breast milk was started quite early and increased steadily in both groups. So the only real difference was the height of the parental, or the magnitude of the parental nutrition that was provided. They show days to regain birth weight was improved in their intervention group, and their energy and protein intake at 4 weeks was better in their intervention group. They really didn't show as strong a relationship with respect to decreasing protein and energy deficits at 28 days of life, at 4 weeks. And perhaps, again, this is my speculation, that they didn't achieve it because when the babies reached 50% of their energy and protein intake enterally, 50% rather of their volume enterally, they stopped their TPN. They stopped their parental nutrition. and it then took them a little while to get to full enteral nutrition, and perhaps that contributed to nice data, but it might have been stronger because they show some associations in their follow-up, but I think those associations might have been stronger had they do what many of us do, continue that parenteral support until the babies are a little closer to full enteral nutrition. So these are the type of associations they found, that energy intake and energy deficit during the first 28 days of life were associated with total brain volume at 40 weeks post-menstrual age, with MDI and PDI scores at 3 months post-term, but not at 9 months. That anthropometrics at 36 weeks post-menstrual age was associated with brain and cortical brain volumes at 40 weeks, and that weight at 36 weeks post-menstrual age was associated with both mental and motor outcomes at a year. I think it could have been stronger. The last paper that I just want to touch on before we move on to the final aspect of this, is an observational report by Franz and colleagues that showed, and this is again, this is how they fed their infants. They were all fed what they described as intensive early nutritional support that included early initiation of parenteral protein and early enteral feeds, and they had they started enteral feeds on day 1 and increased fairly steadily. And they show that if you look at things that contributed to a composite outcome score at, this was at 5.5 years of age, that there were 3 major things. IVH greater than or equal to 3 versus less than 3 contributed to 21%. This is the partial R score, partial R here. Duration of mechanical ventilation greater than 7 versus less than 7 days. 11%, and then a measure of weight gain, 3.5%. And what they found, so standard deviation at birth was significant, standard deviation score at birth rather, but the difference between discharge and birth, that weight gain was significant, not after discharge. So the in-hospital, where we have a chance to make a difference. Now, when they looked at the same data from the point of view of head circumference, they found that the in-hospital was not significant, but the out-of-hospital or post-discharge was significant, that the overall was still 3.5%. So in-hospital or during the hospitalization and after discharge is still important, and we need to continue to follow these kids after. All right, let me just move on to the last part of this, which is to discuss what I think we're now thinking about as standardized feeding guidelines that will minimize the interruption of nutritional support following birth and lead to improved outcomes. Again, trying to decrease this practice variation. Feeding guidelines should be based upon a consensus of early protein and energy, enteral nutrition, evidence-based strategies, potentially better practices, because a lot of this is not based upon randomized controlled trials, which would be still the gold standard. We need to, within these plans, develop some standardized approaches to feeding intolerance. How do you deal with gastric residuals, distension, abdominal growth if it's measured? And we need to have clearly defined strategies to maintain a steady rate of postnatal growth, adjusting nutritional support if growth starts to falter. You can break this down in a number of different ways. I've done this with looking at it from an initiation to a transition to full enteral nutrition, maintenance, and then post-discharge. And this is what we try to achieve in that first within that first 24 hours. We target a glucose infusion rate of about 6 milligrams of glucose per kilogram per minute. We look to start early parenteral protein within hours of birth. And we look at it as to providing that as a to-deliver amount. Think of it as a drug, that you want to start an amount and you want to make sure that the baby gets it. It's like ampicillin or gentamicin or whatever antibiotic you're using. You want to make sure that the baby's going to get that antibiotic. Well, we want to make sure the babies are going to get this protein and that they're going to get the appropriate amount of energy. For babies in this group of kids, less than 1,000 grams, less than 28 weeks of gestation, this is the major focus here, we're going to be providing a total fluid of about 80 to 100 mils per kilogram per day. And in our unit, we start 50 mils per kilogram per day of that. We call it off-hours TPN. You see it as starter or vanilla parental nutrition. And you want to start at least at 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day within this solution. And minimal electrolytes and the rest, basically glucose. This is our off-hours TPN. This is version 2. We've been using it for a number of years. It's a 10% glucose solution, amino acids. We're actually starting at 3 grams per kilogram per day, so this solution is a 6 grams per deciliter solution. So at 50 cc's per kilogram per day, we're providing 3 grams of protein, and we begin this within the first several hours of life. There are a little electrolytes in there because they come in with the amino acid salts. We do provide some calcium, no vitamins, minerals, or lipids, and this is what we're providing. Now, do they use all of that protein appropriately for anabolism? No. They oxidize some of it. We know they do because we're not really giving them enough energy. But within a little bit of time, and I've been criticized that I'm not as fast in this, but this is our unit consensus that this is based on, because you have to get everybody to buy in, and then you start to make changes to improve it. You can begin to increase that energy. So we start. We then work on increasing the parenteral protein up to 4. Most places won't go over about 4.5 grams per kilogram per day. We're really worried about potential toxicities of these. And again, some of these solutions, I mean, we use trophamine. It's based upon, if you know how this stuff is prepared, it's based upon postprandial, an aminogram of breastfed, an hour postprandial term infants. We're feeding 500 grammers of stuff. We don't know what normal amino acids are in these kids. We increase our glucose infusion rate to about 10 over the first week of life. We begin our fat emulsion within 24 hours of birth. We still start, as I said, on the lower end. There is data that starting higher, and there are reports starting at 1.2, 2.4, even up to 3 grams per kilogram per day of lipid is safe, as long as it's given in a slow amount, and you're monitoring these infants. And it's unclear how frequently one needs to monitor triglycerides. And then we increase the percent of total fluids as parenteral nutrition over the first couple of days of life. So we're not starting as older fluids are as parenteral nutrition, because if we need it to stop for some reason, we're going to not be able to provide that to deliver amount of amino acids. We initiate minimal enteral nutrition, trophic feeds, GI stim feeds. Again, as the consensus, as you build this within your nurseries, within the first 24 to 96 hours of age. The TAN study, France, the Wilson study, they were all beginning within the first 24 hours, and I can tell you that you guys are much better at it than we are in the United States. This is still a battle, getting early enteral feed started within the first 24 hours. Preferably donor milk, because it's uncommon to have colostrum, but it's not impossible within the first 24 hours. You have to decide on how long you want to continue these minimal enteral feeds, 24 hours before you start increasing, or the next day. What's the starting volume? Well, most people start about 10% of the total daily volume, say about 112 mils per kilogram per day, but some centers start higher. The German group started at 16 mils per kilogram per day. Some have gone up as high as 20. You have to pick a value, and then you pick a value to increase it, and decide if you're providing human milk, when you're going to fortify it. Generally by 100 mils per kilogram per day. Some people have done it sooner. Some have waited until they've reached full enteral feeds. Again, you're building a consensus within your own practice. Now this is just a simple cartoon that makes the lines work. That's the only reason I like it. We start the parental nutrition at 50%. We increase it to 100% over the next 2 days as total fluid, and the other fluids decreased. So by day 4, I'm at full TPN, but at day 4, I'm also beginning my enteral nutrition, and I increased that by 10% increments. So here I am at day 16 at full enteral nutrition with no parental nutrition. We don't use a 3-in-1 solution, and so we have to individually order our lipids. So as enteral feeds go up, we also need to start backing off on the fat emulsion. And we leave the concentration in our parental solution as what we refer to as an NPO rate of protein, so that if the babies need to be made NPO for any reason, we can use that solution to provide them their full support. Line sepsis needs a central line. We have these babies primarily getting this through a UV. By 14 days of age, we're often close enough that if the babies are doing this well and following this script, most of them don't, unfortunately, that we don't have to put in a PICC line. We can take out our UV, we pull it out by 14 days, and again, you don't need a central line, no line sepsis. We want to maximize how we monitor growth and how we look at how we're feeding these infants as they're growing to make sure we're providing for their needs. Babies with bronchopulmonary dysplasia grow slower, sometimes because we're fluid restricting them and not realizing that we're not giving them enough energy and protein to grow. Because we really don't know what's in mom's milk, and when we fortify it, we're basing that amount, and some of the things we're going to talk about in our cases this afternoon are, well, what's in human milk and what's in those fortifiers, and how do we optimize that? Well, we have to pay attention to that, and sometimes we even need to measure the protein content of the mom's milk to know how to best fortify that. And one of the things we're going to start seeing are units in the nurseries to allow us to look at energy and protein content to individualize this. And then we want to continue to adapt these feedings as infants grow. Need a set of growth curves to follow these kids. These are the Fenton 2013. As I said, they're not the only ones available. And so what do we want to achieve with this implementation of feeding guidelines? Well, what people have described, again, this is not randomized trials. We regain birth weight sooner, we achieve full enteral nutrition sooner, less need for parental nutrition. Our cumulative energy and protein deficits are reduced. There's decreased rates of late onset infection in NEC. There's improved growth, particularly anthropometrics at 36 weeks post-menstrual age and at discharge. Specifically, fewer infants less than the 10th percentile. We've used the data from that glutamine trial to actually show that this more intense approach to nutritional support may actually mediate severity of illness and leads to reduction of hospital stay. So, to summarize and conclude, extrauterine growth restriction may be unavoidable in some infants. Implementation of standardized feeding guidelines facilitates postnatal growth and improved clinical and neurodevelopmental outcomes. And growth and neurodevelopmental outcomes reflect the adequacy of postnatal nutrition. Thank you.